All right, diving into this guide on owning property in Thailand, it seems like you've really been doing your homework. Tons of info here. And, as with any exciting venture, there's always that fine print, right?
Definitely.
Today, we're tackling those Thai property laws, those rules and regulations that can trip people up.
Exactly. Thailand's got its own unique set of rules, and that's where things can get interesting, especially for anyone who isn't familiar with all the intricacies, the legal system, and all that.
Right off the bat, the guide mentions that Thailand's property laws, they're a mix of civil and commercial codes.
Mm-hmm.
Legal jargon, not my favorite, but I'm sensing this is important stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It's the foundation, you see.
Okay.
It's how property ownership works.
Got it.
So you've got the civil and commercial code setting the ground rules.
Right.
The land code gets into the specifics about land itself.
Makes sense.
And then there's the Condominium Act, which you guessed it, lays down the law for, well, condo ownership.
Okay, so depending on what kind of property you're after, different rules come into play.
Precisely.
The guide also dives into those different types of ownership, freehold, leasehold, and then you've got condominium ownership.
Yeah.
You break those down for us.
Sure. Freehold, that's the gold standard.
Okay.
You own the land and the building outright. It's secure, the most secure.
Sounds ideal.
But not that common, unfortunately, for foreigners in Thailand.
So maybe that dream of a giant estate might be a little tricky.
It could be challenging, yeah. But no worries, there are other options.
Yeah.
Leasehold, that's what most foreigners go for. It basically gives you the right to use the property for a set period, usually 30 years.
Okay.
Renewals are often possible, though.
So like a long-term rental, but with some ownership perks.
Exactly. And for condos, foreigners can own individual units, but there's a catch.
Oh,
Total foreign ownership in a building, it can't be more than 49%.
wow.
The remaining 51%, that has to be owned by Thai nationals or companies.
Interesting. So there's a balance there. The guide also mentions direct land ownership for foreigners. It's usually a no-go.
Right.
Does that mean even if I buy a house, I don't actually own the land?
That's exactly it. You can own the structure, sure, but the land's separate.
I see.
That's where those leasehold agreements come in. They give you the right to use the land legally.
For that time.
For a specific time, yep.
But this brings up a crucial point. Understanding those land titles,
Absolutely crucial.
they sound like a potential minefield.
They can be if you're not careful, yeah.
So it's not just having a title, it's knowing what kind of title you're getting.
Exactly. You got it.
Tell me more about that.
All right, the most secure one, it's called a shenote. That's like the gold standard.
Both.
Full ownership, clear, undisputed. It's the safest bet.
So to note, good. Everything else, proceed with caution.
Pretty much. Other titles, like Norsor 3, for instance, those can come with limitations.
Uh-oh.
Might even mean shared ownership. You could think you have full control, and then, bam, discover others have claims on that land.
Wow. Imagine buying your dream beachfront property and then realizing you're sharing the land. What a nightmare.
Happens more often than you'd think, and that's precisely why doing your due diligence is so important.
Okay, due diligence. I hear that phrase a lot.
Right.
What does it actually mean for someone like me wanting to buy property in Thailand?
Think of it like this. It's your detective work.
Okay.
Before you commit to buying anything, you got to verify the seller, make sure they actually own the property, confirm the boundaries are all clear, and check for any hidden claims or restrictions on the land.
So making sure there are no skeletons in the closet, or rather on the property.
You got it. For example, a lien. That could mean someone else has a financial claim on the property, maybe from unpaid debts.
Right.
Or an encumbrance. That might restrict what you can build, how you can use the land,
Right.
like zoning regulations. These surprises, they can turn a dream investment into a legal nightmare.
I can see that happening.
So hiring a good lawyer who specializes in Thai property law, that's not just a good idea, it's a must.
A must.
They're your best defense against these pitfalls.
Yeah.
They can dig into the paperwork, spot those red flags, and guide you through the Thai legal system, which can be pretty complex.
So finding a lawyer who speaks Thai and English, that's crucial.
Absolutely, especially for those contracts.
Makes sense.
You want to make sure everything is crystal clear, no room for ambiguity.
Right, because lost in translation could be a real issue here.
Absolutely. A bilingual lawyer specializing in property law, they're essential.
Okay,
They can make sure that contract reflects what you understand and protects your interests,
got it.
especially those tricky little details you often find hidden in the small print.
So every comma, every clause matters.
It all matters.
What if, despite all this careful planning, things still go wrong? What are the options if a dispute arises? do we head straight to court?
Not necessarily. Negotiation is always the first step. Try to resolve things amicably with the other party. If that fails, then mediation can be very effective.
Right. Remind me how mediation works in this context.
So you've got a neutral third party, a mediator, who helps facilitate the conversation between you and the other party
Right.
to try and reach a solution that works for everyone. It's often less formal,
Yeah.
less adversarial than going to court.
So it's about finding common ground, avoiding a long, drawn-out legal battle.
Precisely. Court proceedings in Thailand, they can be lengthy, expensive,
I see.
so it's really a last resort.
Okay, let's talk about money. What are the financing options, especially for us foreigners dreaming of a property in Thailand?
Well, you've got local Thai banks.
Right.
They can be a good option, but they often have stricter requirements for foreigners.
Like what?
Larger down payments, for example, compared to Thai nationals.
So more cash up front.
Right.
What about interest rates? Are those typically higher for foreigners too?
They can be, yes.
Okay.
Banks tend to see foreign borrowers as a bit more risky. They factor in things like, currency fluctuations, maybe the borrower leaving the country.
So there are definitely some hurdles to clear.
Yeah,
But I've also heard about getting a loan in my home country. Is that an option?
it is. That's called offshore financing.
Okay.
It lets you use your financial standing back home, where you might have a longer credit history, a better understanding of the financial system.
So I could potentially use my existing credit history and income to secure a loan for property in Thailand.
Exactly.
That sounds promising. Are there any downsides to consider, though?
There is one big one: currency fluctuations.
Okay.
If the Thai baht weakens against your home currency, those loan repayments, they could get much more expensive.
So even if I lock in a good interest rate initially, it could be wiped out by changes in the exchange rate.
That's right.
That's definitely something to keep in mind. What about developer financing? I've heard about that. Are those worth exploring?
Some developers do offer financing plans, and those can seem appealing because they're often more flexible. But be careful.
Right.
The interest rates can be higher than what you'd get from a bank, and there might be hidden fees tucked away in the fine print.
Ah, the fine print. The guide also mentioned unregulated lenders.
Yeah.
That sounds a bit risky.
It can be. They might promise easy financing, but it often comes with sky-high interest rates and less legal protection.
Got it.
It's best to stick with reputable banks.
Okay.
Or, if you must consider developer financing, do your homework, get independent legal advice.
Of advice.
Clarity and transparency are key when it comes to finances.
Now let's face it, taxes. Can't avoid them much. What are the main property taxes in Thailand?
All right, the main ones you'll run into are the transfer fee.
Okay.
That's usually 2% of the registered property value. Then there's stamp duty,
Okay.
calculated at 0.5%, but sometimes it's waived.
Right.
And then there's withholding tax.
That's got it.
That's often 1% of either the appraised or selling price, whichever is higher.
Okay, so multiple taxes to factor in. What about when you eventually sell the property? Is there a capital gains tax in Thailand?
It's not called that specifically, but it's essentially factored into that withholding tax when you sell.
Got it.
The amount you pay depends on how long you've owned the property. Hold on to it longer, you'll generally owe less.
So playing the long game has its perks.
It does.
Any other good news on the tax front? The guide mentions some incentives for foreign investors.
Right. Thailand offers tax incentives to attract foreign investment,
Okay.
especially in specific zones or for certain types of properties.
Interesting.
These can include things like reduced tax rates, exemptions on certain fees, or even tax breaks on rental income.
Okay, that's definitely worth looking into. So before I even consider buying property in Thailand, I should be talking to a tax expert.
Absolutely.
Okay.
They can help you navigate the Thai tax system, see what incentives you might qualify for, and make sure your purchase is structured in the most tax-efficient way.
Great advice. Now, let's say despite all our careful planning, a dispute arises.
Right.
What are the first steps to take? Should we try to resolve it amicably before considering legal action?
You got it. Direct negotiation with the other party is always the best first step.
Okay.
If that doesn't work, mediation, like we talked about earlier, can be really effective.
Right. And if mediation fails, is arbitration an option before going to court?
Absolutely. It's more formal, where an arbitrator, usually a legal expert, hears both sides and makes a binding decision.
Okay.
It can be a good alternative to court, especially if you want a faster, more private resolution.
Got it. But if court is unavoidable, what should we expect? The guide described a potentially lengthy and complex process.
The Thai legal system is complex, and court proceedings can be time-consuming.
Okay.
That's why having a good lawyer who understands property law is so important.
Right.
They can represent you effectively, make sure your case is presented well.
So meticulous documentation is key.
Absolutely. The court will scrutinize everything. So clear contracts, property titles, any relevant documentation, all essential.
Okay, that makes perfect sense.
Clarity and thoroughness are your allies in any legal proceeding.
The guide also highlighted how important it is to stay updated on changes to property law. Any tips on doing that effectively?
Legal newsletters can be a good resource.
Okay.
Lots of law firms that specialize in property law offer updates on new legislation or policy changes.
Right.
Stuff that could impact property owners.
What about those online expat forums?
Those can be super helpful.
Yeah.
Online forums for expats living in Thailand are full of first-hand experiences,
Right.
up-to-date info on practical matters, including changes in those property regulations.
So tapping into that shared knowledge, real-life experience.
Exactly.
And, of course, regular consultations with the legal expert, just to make sure I'm not missing any important updates.
Definitely.
Got it. Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about protecting our investment. What types of insurance should we consider when buying property in Thailand?
The essential ones are home insurance, which covers the structure of your property against damage. Things like fire, floods, or theft, contents insurance to protect your belongings inside, and liability insurance in case someone gets hurt on your property.
Are there any legal requirements around insurance in Thailand?
Not all types are mandatory, but your mortgage lender might require certain coverage.
Got it.
It's always best to check with your lender or a legal expert to be sure.
Okay, carefully choosing the right insurance. That's another crucial step.
It is.
Now, last but not least, let's talk about the human side of things.
Yeah.
Any advice on engaging with the local community and authorities in Thailand?
Building relationships with your neighbors is so important.
Okay.
Attend local events, be respectful of local customs, and just be open to communication.
What about working with local government officials? Any tips on making that process go smoothly?
When you're dealing with local authorities, be organized, be proactive, and be clear in your communication.
Okay.
Having your documents in order and being ready to ask questions can make a big difference.
Fantastic. I think we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the legal framework, discussed the different types of ownership, stressed the importance of due diligence, a good lawyer, clear contracts.
And financing options.
Right, those unavoidable taxes,
Uh-huh.
and the importance of insurance, building those relationships with the local community.
Absolutely.
You've given us a lot to think about. In the next part, let's dive into some specific scenarios, case studies, see how all this plays out in real life. I'm ready to learn from those who have walked this path before.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our deep dive all about owning property in Thailand. It's great to be continuing this conversation.
Yeah, I'm so glad I feel so much more prepared already, but I know there's always more to learn. Covered a lot of ground on that last part. Legal frameworks, types of ownership, those tricky land titles, due diligence, financing options. You really gave us a fantastic overview.
It's so important to have that foundation, you know? Now let's make these concepts real, bring them to life with some real-world examples.
That's exactly what I was hoping for. The guide mentioned this case where someone bought a property with a Norsor 3 land title, but they didn't really understand what that meant. What happened there?
Yes, that's a classic example of why those land titles are so crucial. In this case, the buyer, well, they were attracted by what seemed like a fantastic deal, you know, on a piece of land in Phuket. But they didn't realize that Norsor 3, it often comes with limitations.
Right.
Unclear boundaries, maybe, or even potential claims from other people.
Okay.
So after buying the property, they hit a wall when they tried to build their dream vacation home.
Oh, no.
Neighbors disputed the boundaries. Turned out there were these unresolved ownership claims going back years.
So they basically bought a property that was tangled up in all these legal issues.
Exactly. It highlights why it's not enough just to have a title. You really have to understand what that title means.
Right.
In Thailand, you can't just rely on the seller's word, you know. You need to do your own research, or even better, have a legal expert look over all those documents really carefully.
That's a lesson learned the hard way, for sure.
It is.
It seems like due diligence is a theme here, a really important one.
It's crucial.
Any other examples where skipping that step led to problems?
Oh, there are many, unfortunately. One that comes to mind is this case where a foreign buyer was so eager to purchase a luxury villa in Koh Samui.
Okay.
They just fell in love with the property, ready to sign on that dotted line.
I can see that happening, the excitement of finding that perfect place.
Absolutely. But in their haste, they didn't check for existing Lillowlands on the property.
Oh.
Turns out, the previous owner had a lot of outstanding debts.
Oh, no.
And those debts, well, they were tied to the villa.
So they basically inherited the previous owner's financial problem.
Exactly. Due diligence isn't just about making sure the seller's the real owner or that the boundaries are clear.
Oh, yeah.
It's about uncovering any financial risks, too, liabilities that could be attached to that property.
That's a costly oversight.
It can be.
So due diligence is about protecting yourself, making sure you're not inheriting someone else's problems.
Precisely.
Okay, so due diligence is crucial. Got it.
Yeah.
What about contracts? What are some of the common pitfalls that people fall into when they're drafting or reviewing contracts in Thailand?
One of the biggest mistakes is not having that contract translated into both Thai and English. While you can have a contract in just English, having both versions ensures that everyone understands the term.
Right. Makes sense. Making sure everyone's literally on the same page.
Exactly. Another pitfall is overlooking those specific details.
Okay.
Like, a contract might say the purchase price clearly, but it doesn't say who's responsible for other fees.
Right.
Like transfer fees or taxes.
So those seemingly minor details, they can become major expenses.
They absolutely can, and it's often these small things that cause disputes later on.
I see.
It's really important to make sure that contract outlines every financial obligation, so there's no room for confusion.
So clarity and precision are key.
They're essential.
It's about preventing those what-if situations from becoming real problems.
Yes. You got it. A well-written contract, it should anticipate potential issues and address them up front.
Okay.
For example, what happens if there are delays in construction or the property is not delivered as promised, those sorts of things.
So having a lawyer review the contract, that's non-negotiable.
Absolutely. A lawyer who really knows Thai property law, they're invaluable.
Okay. Definitely seeing the value of that expert legal advice.
Good.
Now let's talk about financing. You mentioned local Thai banks and offshore financing as options for foreign buyers. Can you give us some specific examples just to illustrate the pros and cons of each?
Sure. Let's say you're looking at a condo in Chiang Mai. You found the perfect unit. You're ready to get financing.
I'm with you. Let's say I don't have a huge amount of cash to put down up front. What would a local Thai bank usually require?
A local bank would probably ask for a larger down payment from a foreigner compared to a Thai national.
Okay.
Could be 30%, even 40% of the purchase price up front.
That's a lot of money to have on hand.
It is. And interest rates, those could also be higher for foreigners. Of course.
Because banks often see foreign borrowers as a bit more risky. They might factor in currency fluctuations, the chance you might leave the country, things like that.
I can understand that perspective, but it does make it tougher, more expensive for us to get financing.
It does, but going with a local bank, it does have its advantages. You're dealing with a local institution that really knows the Thai property market.
Right.
They'll have established procedures, all the documents they need, which can make things smoother.
So it's a trade-off then, potentially higher costs, but a more straightforward process. What about offshore financing? How does that work, typically?
Let's say you're from Australia and you want to buy a villa in Phuket.
Okay.
You could go to a bank in Australia, apply for a mortgage there.
So I'd use my Australian credit history and income to secure the loan.
Exactly. That's one of the big advantages of offshore financing.
Okay.
You're leveraging your financial situation back home where you probably have a longer credit history, better understanding of the financial system.
I'd repay the loan in Australian dollars. That's right. Which brings us to one of the main risks of offshore financing. Currency fluctuations.
Oh, right.
If the Thai baht weakens against the Australian dollar, your repayments, they could become a lot more expensive.
So even if I secure a good interest rate at the beginning, it could be wiped out if the exchange rate changes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You really have to factor in that currency risk when you're thinking about offshore financing.
Got it.
Assess your tolerance for risk, how comfortable you are with those potential fluctuations.
Okay, that's an important thing to consider. So we've got local banks, maybe a smoother process, but possibly higher costs than offshore financing, which uses your home country system, but comes with that currency risk. It's a balancing act.
It is. The best approach will depend on your situation, how much risk you're comfortable with, and the specific property you're buying.
This is so helpful in understanding all those nuances with financing. Now, I'm curious about those tax incentives you mentioned earlier. Can you give us some real examples of how those work for foreign investors?
Sure, Thailand has these incentives to attract foreign investment, especially in certain sectors or regions.
Okay.
If you invest in a designated economic zone, for instance, you might get lower corporate income tax rates.
Interesting. So there are certain areas where the government's really encouraging investment.
Exactly. These zones are often strategically located, offer all sorts of benefits to businesses there.
What about incentives for individuals, people buying property? Are there any specific programs for that?
There are. For example, the government has programs to attract foreign retirees.
Okay.
Those often offer tax breaks on pension income or easier visa processes.
So if I'm retiring in Thailand, buying a property, there could be tax advantages for me to look into.
Exactly. These incentives, they can vary depending on your age, nationality, the type of property.
Wow, this is great information. It seems like there's a lot to consider to make sure you're being as tax efficient as possible when you invest in Thai property.
There is, and that's why talking to a tax advisor who understands Thai property law is so valuable.
Thank-
They can guide you through all the complexities of the tax system, find any potential incentive you might qualify for.
That's definitely going on my list of things to do. You've given us so much to think about. In this part of our deep dive, we've looked at real-life examples, the pros and cons of different financing, and even some of those tax incentives.
We have.
So what's next on our agenda?
In the final part, we're going to focus on the practicalities of actually owning property in Thailand. Things like property management, maintenance, and, the cultural side of living in this beautiful country.
Can't wait to learn more about that. Let's dive in. Welcome back to our deep dive on owning property in Thailand. We've covered so much, from the legal stuff to financing, even those potential tax benefits. Now, let's talk about what it's actually like to be a property owner in Thailand.
Right, buying a property, that's just the first step. There's a whole other side to it. Practical stuff, cultural things you need to know.
Exactly. Let's start with property management. What are the key things to think about, especially if I'm not living there year-round? Which, let's be honest, probably applies to a lot of foreign buyers.
You're right, it's a common situation. Finding a good property management company, that's crucial if you're not there to oversee everything yourself.
So it's like having someone you trust on the ground taking care of things.
Exactly. A good property manager, they'll handle it all. Routine maintenance, dealing with tenants if you're renting it out.
Right.
They'll make sure bills are paid, keep you updated if anything comes up. Basically, your eyes and ears on the ground.
That sounds so helpful, especially if you're miles away. Any tips on finding a good property management company? Where do I even start?
Word of mouth is always a good place to start.
All right.
Talk to other property owners in the area, see who they recommend.
Makes sense.
You can also look online, check reviews, find companies with a good track record.
So just like buying the property, due diligence is key when you're choosing a property manager.
Absolutely. You're trusting them with your investment. You don't want to just pick anyone.
Exactly.
Taking the time to find someone trustworthy, experienced, it can save you a lot of trouble later on.
Okay, what about maintenance? What kind of costs should I be thinking about to keep the property in good shape?
It varies depending on the property.
Yeah.
But you should factor in things like cleaning, gardening, pool maintenance if you have one,
Right.
and repairs, things like the AC breaking down, plumbing issues. Those can pop up unexpectedly.
So it's not just the mortgage payments, there are those ongoing costs too.
Exactly. It's important to have a realistic budget.
Right.
Include all those ongoing expenses so you're not caught off guard.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about the cultural aspects of living in Thailand. The guide mentioned how important it is to respect local customs. What are some things to keep in mind as a foreign property owner?
Thailand has such a wonderful culture, so showing respect is really important, especially if you want to integrate into the community. One thing is the traditional greeting. You put your hands together like you're praying and bow your head slightly.
I've heard of the way. It's such a beautiful gesture.
It is. It's a way to show respect, acknowledge the people around you.
Okay, what else?
Another thing, be mindful when you visit temples. Dress modestly. Remember that feet are considered unclean in Thai culture.
Right,
So don't point your feet at people or anything sacred.
got it. Modest dress and watch those feet. What about communication? I only know a little bit of Thai. Is that going to be a big problem?
Don't worry, English is pretty widely spoken, especially in tourist areas and among people who work in tourism.
That's good to know.
But communication can be tricky sometimes, so be patient, try to understand.
Okay.
A smile and a friendly attitude can go a long way.
So it's about being respectful, understanding those cultural differences, and being open to learning.
Exactly. Embrace the local culture. It'll make your experience so much richer.
Right, and it'll help you build relationships with your neighbors and the community.
Absolutely. Thais are generally very welcoming, very friendly.
Okay.
Just introduce yourself, go to local events, participate in community activities. It's a great way to make friends.
I like that.
And remember, food is a big part of Thai culture. So offering a small gift or inviting your neighbors for a meal, that's a wonderful way to connect.
Love that. Food always brings people together. As we wrap up this deep dive, any final words of wisdom for someone who's thinking about owning property in Thailand?
Go for it. Thailand's an amazing place. Beautiful scenery, vibrant culture, delicious food, friendly people. Do your research, get expert advice when you need it, and most importantly, enjoy the experience.
Well said. This deep dive has been so helpful, really eye-opening. We've covered everything from the legal and financial side to the practical stuff and the cultural aspects of owning property in Thailand.
It's a lot to take in, but remember, preparation is key. Respect those local customs and have a positive attitude. That's the recipe for success.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you feel more confident, better equipped to navigate this exciting world of owning property in Thailand. Remember, knowledge is power, and now you've got the information to make smart decisions and turn those Thai property dreams into reality. Until next time, happy house hunting.